If you're still treating podcasting as just a content play, you're missing the bigger picture. It's not just media. It's truly, I believe, a business development strategy. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unearth with Shelly Hughes. I'm Shelly Hughes. In this podcast, we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of building a profitable, passionate brand. We talk about the wins, losses, and especially lessons learned of what it takes to build the business of your dreams. And I want to kind of set the scene, right, of what we're going to talk about today. You're walking a potential client through your studio. They weren't responding to any of your emails the past month, but now they're shaking your hand. They're impressed with everything you built, and their ego is a little bit boosted, and they're sitting down to tell you about your story. And the hardest part of B2B and even B2C is opening the right doors. And it's my belief, and it's from the success of a lot of our clients, that podcasting could be the key to help you get there. When executed well, a podcast isn't just content. It's your secret weapon for building authority, forging relationships, and really seeding your sales. And so I want to talk about podcasting as a business development strategy. We started this strategy actually back in the COVID years. So I don't know if anyone knows out there, but when I started the company, I was essentially fractional CMO. And I left my old job, and I was fractional CMO for these companies who were doing that scary P word pivot of not just their marketing, but entire business models because of COVID. And the goal, right, for thinking about podcasting as a business development strategy, and the goal at the time was not to get 1 million listeners. Your goal is not to become, necessarily, it doesn't have to be, not to become the biggest podcaster or podcast show in the world. It's about the right relationships. And so you can think of a podcast as your most strategic coffee meeting, right? And why it works is it's an ego boost for guests. It's really about building relationships and aligning values. And so what you do is essentially, what we did for many clients, especially back in the COVID days, is people weren't going to meetings anymore. They had an amazing excuse not to show up to a meeting. No one knew what was going on, so they didn't want to spend money. They didn't want to take meetings. They didn't want to sign contracts. And I had clients that said, if we could just get them into our office or studio or physical therapy clinic, then it would be an easy sell. But they're just not saying yes to a meeting. And what we did was we said, okay, you want to start a podcast anyway because you keep complaining about your social media. It's really hard to keep up with. So let's start a podcast. But the goal is to invite people that you want to be your clients, or you want to nurture relationships with, or you want to be a great referral system onto the podcast as a guest. It opens the door that wouldn't have been open otherwise. And you're not just stroking an ego, right? Because everyone wants to be on a podcast, especially if they don't do it often. But you are opening someone up to learning more about them, right? You're asking them really specific questions. They're learning about you. You're spending up to 2 hours with someone, even more. Like the other day, I had a 3-hour-long podcast episode, only planned on it being an hour. And we talked for about 45 minutes before and probably an hour after. So I was with this person all afternoon. And that's what I do. When I do my episodes, I book out an entire afternoon for this person. And it just, again, it opens up doors that wouldn't have been opened otherwise. Okay, think about this. Who should run it? Right? How to staff it, that kind of thing. I have to say the host matters. They should be a great face of the brand, and maybe it's a spokesperson, a salesperson, a relationship builder, right? And the strategy here is really outsource what you can, of course, but make sure someone owns the process. Someone in your company, they want to do this. And then you have a guest strategy, right? Think about who do you want to build relationships with? Potential partners, clients, referrals, and then when you develop the podcast, you have to think of how can you match the topic of your podcast to something that these people that you want on the podcast can talk about for hours. Let's say you own a jewelry company, right? And you're not trying to get meetings with other businesses that are clients and decision makers. We did this for a couple different clients. We had one client was a nonprofit, a very specific industry. And so she made a podcast all about why this industry is important. And she invited thought leaders from the industry onto her podcast. And she had the best year of her life from doing this strategy. We also worked with a quite large physical therapy company. In the middle of COVID, a lot of their sales was knocking on doors with a nice big tray of Philly pretzels and handing it to the office staff and trying to get 2 minutes with a physician to help make that referral, right? And all of a sudden, COVID hit and people weren't doing that anymore, right? People didn't want you to come into the office. So at the time we said, okay, how do we get them to come to our clinic? If they could just see our clinic and how unique and different it is, it would be an easy sell to get them to start referring our ideal patient to us. So from a B2B perspective, it makes a lot of sense. But let's think about it real quick from a B2C perspective. And that was just 2 examples, by the way. Let's say you own a jewelry company, right? And your ideal audience is maybe like young millennial, older Gen Z women who they just want to show up as their best selves. They do things that help them better themselves, their relationships, that kind of thing. And so let's say that you make a podcast all about, like a lifestyle podcast, all about that topic of bettering yourself, being your best self, yada, yada, yada. You then invite on that specific audience with those specific values onto your podcast, maybe thought leaders in that space, whatever. And you have a podcast. A few things happening here. 1, you are going to, when you promote this, your guest will also promote this episode. The idea is if they have a little bit of a following, then their audience, you want to be your audience, will see the episode. And what's even more interesting is that as a jewelry company, your podcast theme, what you talk about, is all about lifestyle and not a thing about jewelry. If you want to, you can, of course, put some ad space in there for yourself and talk about your jewelry. But it's a strategy that is not straight up sales or straight up marketing, right? It's really more PR and media. It's all owned media. You can do whatever you want for this, right? But I think the key components here are finding a really authentic kind of bridge between your product and your ideal audience. Because here's the thing. Let's say a jewelry company, they're like, oh, I love this idea. I'm going to make a podcast all about jewelry. How we make it, how we source the metal, what we do at trade shows, like all this type of stuff. Who's going to listen to a podcast like that? Probably other jewelers or maybe people who are hobbyists, whatever it is, right? Your target audience is not going to listen to that podcast. So when you think about, okay, what do you want this podcast to be about? You have to first do a deep dive into your ideal audience for then you to understand what do they listen to? What do they want to listen to? And then you bring on thought leaders within that niche that has amazing audiences themselves. When you do the collaborative post and they share the content, you get in front of your ideal audience then because they share an audience that you have or you want. When you do this, of course, you want to make sure that whether you're B2B, B2C, whatever, you're trying to make this a really great experience for your guests. So you really have to think about the experience. You have to think about your systems for this. Send media kits before they go to record the podcast, right? Say, hey, this is what the podcast is about. These questions I'm going to ask. Please send us your headshot, your bio. So all this stuff, because you don't want to be scrounging for this type of stuff after the podcast is already recorded. So this is what you should wear. This is what you shouldn't wear in front of the camera, all that kind of stuff. So they feel like, wow, this is actually really put together and really professional. The more professional it seems, the more they're going to think of you as a higher value relationship. And so you want to gather their assets. You want to really schedule with intention, right? Make the interview valuable and make it expansive. So after, make sure you take time to debrief, connect, deepen the relationship. And, what you could then do after the fact, after it's reported, after they have this great experience, you say, hey, I would love to know, do you have anyone else that you think would be a great person to have on a podcast like this? Someone high vibration, someone that maybe owns a business, whatever this ideal guest is for you, invite more of those people on to the podcast and ask them if they have any referrals. Have them introduce you, and all of a sudden you have this amazing pipeline of warm intros that, if you're B2B, might be warm intros to potential clients. If you're B2C, maybe it's just something else. But it's just this podcast flywheel, right? And so you can then, you think about repurposing content, right? I always like to think repurposing as, what is your flagship content and what can you turn it into? So, for example, one podcast episode could turn into a blog post on your website to help you with SEO. It could turn into a LinkedIn article. It could turn into 3, 4, 5 different sound bites for Reels or YouTube Shorts. It could turn into thought leadership carousels on Instagram. It could turn into 100 different posts on X. Truly, you could put the entire transcription of the interview in ChatGPT and say, I would like you to take out 100 different really impactful that goes on X, Y, and Z quotes that we could post on X, right? And quotes, all this type of stuff. And with that reach, of course, you want to tag guests, you want to do collaboration posts, you want to extend that visibility. And just remember, this launching a podcast isn't necessarily about audience growth or getting 1 million followers. You might get like 7 YouTube followers and you don't care. This strategy specifically, it's a business development strategy disguised as a content marketing strategy. And so what you care about here is reputation and reach and not numbers. And I have to tell you, the best podcast strategies aren't downloads first. They're truly relationships first. And if you want better clients, you can't just cold call. If you want better clients, you don't cold call them, right? I'm not saying cold calling is dead, but just invite them on and give them a mic. So I hope this was helpful. I really hope this strategy that we've seen successful over and over again with our marketing clients and our fractional CMO clients, I hope it helps you. So if you like this episode, like, review, that helps us get these episodes in more earbuds. And I hope to see you next week.